My name is Franklin, and I'm an atheist.
How would you know at all if you're being accurate?
I've read a lot about religion.
What exactly does through Jesus Christ mean?
What is it about their religion that resonates with who they are? It's not an anthropomorphic being. Is there an enemy? How does their religion make them a better person?
Can you explain to me and anybody who doesn't know what a mitzvah is?
What do they think is missing about how we understand the world?
What would be the difference between praying on a subject and just thinking on a subject?
Why don't people have superpowers anymore?
I think it's important to talk to them and find out what they believe.
Hello everyone! Thanks again to everybody who's helping out on Patreon. You can see the links here and down below in the thingy. Way back in episode 7, my guest was Teshin Sweger, and we had a conversation about Zen Buddhism. However, my guest today took issue with some of Mr. Sweger's answers, so I invited him on the talk. And that's actually the point of this show, to get a wide array of opinions. They're both Zen Buddhists, but they disagree on how it should be practiced. I hope you enjoy the interview, and don't forget to stick around till the end for two things.
Hello and welcome to the What They Believe series. Today my guest is C.F. Leonhard, a Zen priest with the Kuanyin Mandala Zen Society. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, sir.
So, were you always a Zen Buddhist or did you convert?
No, I was not. I don't think that there are any native Swedes who were ever born into Buddhism as of yet. I converted when I was about 15, but on my own, because I had no idea if there were any Zen temples or Buddhist temples or priests or monks or anything in my city. But I had found a book at the library about Buddhism. So I started doing what basically was Zen Buddhist meditation on my own at home when I was 15. And I'm now 33, so you can do the math yourself in regards to how long ago that was. And then I stumbled upon another book called I think it's called The Three Pillars of Zen in English, by a Zen master called Philip Kapleau. And most Buddhists in the US, they came to Buddhism through Alan Watts, as I understand it. And most people in Europe came through Philip Kapleau. This was about the time when internet started getting really useful. So I started Googling his name, and I found out that he had an affiliated Sangha, an affiliated Zen center, just in the city next to mine. So I went there when I was 20 and became officially baptized or lay ordained into Zen Buddhism. That was my introduction. And then many years later, in fact, in 2009, 2019 it was, I ordained as a Zen Buddhist priest within the Kuanyin Mandala School of Zen Society. Yeah, and then I even got a authorization as a Dharma teacher, which is a separate thing, from two different Taiwanese temples, one temple and one monastery, but they're under the same umbrella organization in Taiwan. Just by happenstance, actually, because I started talking to a Taiwanese monk through Facebook. And he, just after a few years, he asked if I was interested in becoming a Dharma teacher, because he thought that the situation in Sweden wasn't so good related to the Dharma. So yeah, and here I am.
I asked a similar question to the pagans who've come on the show, but it's a fair question to ask to any religion. Can you at all be certain that you're practicing your religion in a way that is true to the original intent, and does that matter?
No, I can't. I'm currently studying comparative religion and history at Costa University. So I have to approach even my own tradition and my own religion from an academic perspective. And we know that the sutras and suttas and all of the texts were written hundreds of years after the death of Shakyamuni Buddha, who founded Buddhism. So no, we can't know anything for sure, especially the teachings in the periphery and all of that. We can't know that for sure. A lot of texts we know weren't even written or said by him, but by his students, and they might have misinterpreted things. And there was this commentator called Bodhidharma who collected what's known as the Abhidhamma, which is like a systematization of the teachings. So it has evolved regardless of which Buddhist tradition you follow. But what I do believe is that the core reason why we practice is still the same as it was 2,500 years ago, which is understanding the suffering, or dukkha, as we call it. The most common translation for dukkha is suffering. Perhaps your viewers have heard that before, that Buddhists believe that everything is suffering. That's not true, but it's usually translated as suffering. And I do believe that that core is still true. That's why we're here. So that's why it doesn't really matter either if all of the stories are historically correct or not. We know that many of them probably aren't, because they contain some quite mystical experiences and events that doesn't really line up with the historical and archaeological record and all of that. But it's sort of the same like Spider-Man. We know that Spider-Man doesn't exist, but his teachings of, with great power comes great responsibility, that's still true. So to me, at least, it doesn't matter if Shakyamuni Buddha existed at all, or if it's pure fiction. I know to some other Buddhists it does matter, and I totally respect that. But for me personally, I'm not that interested in it. Not from a Buddhist perspective. As an historian, I think it's really interesting to learn how the religion and the tradition has evolved and where it came from. But for my own spiritual practice, I couldn't care less.
That leads me to my next question. What, in your opinion, is the biggest Western misconception of Zen Buddhism, specifically, or Buddhism in general, if there's not something specific about Zen?
I think I have to approach this from two different perspectives, a Western and a Swedish, because Western culture isn't a monolith, at least not here in Europe, which is very. It's quite interesting to talk to Americans sometimes, because they believe that their culture is just the same as ours in Europe, and then when they come here, they discover that they feel extremely alienated due to how they act and just differences. So the biggest Western misconception, I think, is that Zen priests and Zen monks and Zen practitioners were these stoic, emotionless automatons, sort of, who, we think that life is suffering, so nothing matters. All we do is just think of ourselves, and we sit down and we just block out every emotion, and we don't care about anything else. And if you ever come to a Zen temple or Zen monastery, or talk to a person like that, go to any sort of location like that, you will find those practitioners that I call Zen cosplayers, who think that that's how a Zen Buddhist should be. So, you ask them anything and they just answer like, it doesn't matter what you ask them, they already have their answer made up, like, it's a bridge over water with flowers flowing under, and it doesn't mean anything. They're just trying to sound Zen. And I've been there. I was just like that when I started out. And, I thought that I knew everything, and I thought that, I'd read a few books, and now I'm a Zen master, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says. I know what Zen is, and it's being just stoic. Then a few years after you practice this, you realize that that's not the case. If you look at many of the great masters and you read their poetry and their commentaries, there's a lot of humor in it, although it can be quite dark humor at times as well. You have Zen masters killing cats, and you have Zen masters chopping off their own arms, and it's sort of like dark British humor.
What do you like about being a Zen priest, and is there anything you would like to change?
I don't like anything about being a Zen priest, I think. It's quite funny. When I ordained, all of my friends and family, they went like, "Oh, congratulations, this is so good. I'm really happy for you." And everyone I knew who was already a Zen priest, they were like, "Oh, my condolences. Oh, I'm so sorry." Because being a Zen priest isn't about gaining anything. It's all about losing stuff and giving parts of yourself to the practice and to help others. We have this ideal called the Bodhisattva ideal, which means that you postpone your own awakening in order to help others. And that's a vow that I've personally taken quite literally, and I really take it to heart. So it means that if someone writes me on Messenger in the middle of the night and they have questions about Buddhism, I can't just roll over and ignore that until the morning. I have to get up and I have to answer that. And if someone contacts me and their daughter or their son just died or something like that, which has happened, I can't just be sorry about that. I have to stay focused, and I have to think, okay, what can I do in this situation, and what can I not do in this situation? Where are my limits? And there's a much bigger responsibility as a Zen priest than you have as just a general Zen practitioner or something like that. That said, of course, there are benefits, not to me particularly, but I know, I won't mention any names, but I do know that some have made quite a lot of money as a Zen priest, and they go on lectures and tours and that sort of stuff. I haven't made a dime yet, but maybe one day, I don't know. So yeah, there sure are benefits, but there's really not a difference between being a Zen priest and being just anyone else. Being a Zen priest doesn't mean that you're more awakened or enlightened than anyone else. It just means that you have responsibilities. So, and regarding the question if there's anything I want to change, I mean, there are these few years, we've been more and more aware of misconducts within every organization, be it Buddhist or secular or Christian or whatever, and be it regarding sexual relationships or just abuse of power in general. And that has happened within Zen Buddhism as well. So if there was something I'd like to change, it would be more structures of accountability, so to speak, which is really hard, for example, here in Sweden, where it's, my Zen center, that it's only me. I'm the only one there. And I sit there and I meditate. And if people come, they come. If they don't, they don't. But in these larger organizations that you have in the US and in other places, they have started creating these structures, which I think is really great. So I think that we're moving in a positive direction. There are things I'd like to see changed in, the tradition as a whole. There are basically two major Zen Buddhist traditions. There's Soto and there's Rinzai. There are things I would like to see changed within Soto and within Rinzai, but it's also not really my place to comment on that quite yet, because I'm not that, I don't have insight quite yet into those organizations and those cultures. So I'd rather not comment on that right now, but perhaps in a few years.
Do you believe that the natural state of the universe moves toward goodness? And what even is goodness?
That requires some form of omnipotentism that I do not possess quite yet. But if I hazard a guess, I think that talking about good or evil in such a large scale almost makes it, I can't fathom how you travel to the moon. So how can I speak on, in which direction the entire universe is moving? And also there's, the eternal question, what is good, what is evil? But if we put it in a Buddhist context, Shakyamuni Buddha, he talked about evil and good all the time in the different suttas and sutras. And what that could be translated as is what is constructive and what is destructive. So that's the way the Buddhist thinks of good and evil. And in that sense, I think that the universe is only moving towards a more and more balanced state. And I think that can be applied to every human being as well. If we see ourselves as a microcosm, that's sort of what we do when we meditate, when we do our sasan, as we call it. We're sort of trying to just let things disperse and fall where they are. Just, like when you put salt in water, it just diffuses all over. You don't have to do anything in order for that to happen. You just have to let it be. And that's what we do during meditation. We try to let our microcosm just be and let everything just settle. But then we come and mess things up for ourselves when we stop meditating, because then all of the destructive thoughts returns and all of that. So if we bring it down to such a small level, I think it's more easily applied to our lives.
Our interview today came from you respectfully disagreeing with the previous guest. For my show, this is great because we get more perspectives. But most religions will like everyone to believe roughly the same thing because it makes the work easier. How does Zen Buddhist clergy resolve theological differences between each other?
The easy answer would be that we don't. Many Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, their core is based on a belief. And that's why you need to share a belief, because if you don't share that belief, then you break the core. While many Asian religions and traditions, so to speak, Their core isn't in the belief, rather it's in the practice, what you do. So it's much more action-oriented than thought or belief-oriented. So we might argue, and we do all the time. Like if you visit the Buddhist forums on Facebook, that's all we do. We just argue. And I'm an admin for a few of them, so I know what I'm talking about. Banning is one of those responsibilities I have as a Zen priest online, I think. But the thing is, it doesn't matter how much we argue and how much we disagree, because 5 minutes later, we have to sit down on our mats and just take our safus, which is our pillows, and we meditate. And that's our core. So as long as we have this practice of meditating, then it's fine to debate and discuss different aspects. Then, of course, there are also core beliefs. And, there are these books called, I think there's one book called What Makes You a Buddhist? And then there's this book called Why I'm Not a Buddhist. And I think there are different books with titles such as that. And there are, of course, common beliefs like the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths and all of that. But the thing is, most people who visit Zen centers here in Sweden, they're not Buddhists, but they can come anyway. We have a lot of Christians who come, a lot of Catholics especially, and they meditate with us because it doesn't matter that much what we believe, it's what we do. But it's much harder for me as a Zen Buddhist to go to a Christian mass, for example, because that's what they do. They tell me what they believe and what I probably should believe as well. And then maybe we eat some bread and drink some wine. But that's sort of even that act is religious. But just sitting down and just breathing doesn't require a religion. But then there are, of course, religious aspects as well. That's why I keep calling it a religion. But we don't even require, at my Zen center, we don't require people to do mantras or chant or do the Bodhisattva vows, which other centers do. So there's a difference there as well. I think that people shouldn't be forced to take vows just because they want to meditate.
In our previous episode on Zen Buddhism, I was intrigued by the story of Siddhartha being threatened or tempted with power and riches by Mara. My guest dismissed the literal belief in this story, but found a spiritual meaning. Do you believe stories such as this are literally true?
My easy answer would be yes, no, both, and neither. Because I take a rather agnostic approach to it, because I don't know. And I've never experienced anything like that. So I can't say. The reason why I objected to that stance was basically because it's easy for us from the West especially, and I have to be careful with my words here, but it's easily for us from the West to find something new, and then we instantly think that we can improve on it. And we think that we actually know the proper meaning behind all of this. It's okay if you other people, you can believe whatever you want, but we know the truth. So to say that all of those supernatural stories are only metaphors and not to be taken literally, that's sort of, you have to do a bit of walking on eggshells when it comes to those sort of statements. And from an historical perspective, I don't think that they were written as metaphors. I think that many of them were written as, what's the English word? But sort of like epiphanies or visions that different monks had, which you can have during meditation quite easily, especially if you do it long periods of times. But you can absolutely see it as a metaphor as well, because like we talked about in the beginning, what's important is the teaching. The story doesn't really matter for me personally, but it does matter for others. And as such, I don't want to dismiss that either, as long as it's not doing any harm. And we do have examples of those teachings turning into self-harm and self-immolation. And even, this last week, we had a monk who decapitated himself due to faulty logic surrounding the different traditional interpretations. So you have to be careful when it comes to those sort of things as well. That's why I don't want to say that they're false or they're only metaphors or whatever, because I'm just saying, let's focus on the teaching here. What are we supposed to learn from this story? And and the rest doesn't really matter. But when I do ceremonies, when I do rites, I 100% believe what I'm doing at that time. I do believe that I'm offering to the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas and all of those. But then when I step back, I might not. But it's important to believe with your entire body and all of your minds exactly what you're doing at that time, which might sound like a contradiction, but I believe that Zen is famous for those as well.
And I can get where somebody can get a lesson from that. However, the story of the Bodhidharma creating tea plants by tearing off his own eyelids because he was having trouble staying awake while meditating, not exactly sure. I definitely can't take that as literally true, since you can't grow tea plants from eyelids. But what do you think a lesson we should be learning from that story?
Well, I didn't say that every story contains a lesson either. But if we return to the story with Mara, where she is trying to tempt Shakyamuni Buddha with riches and all of that, that's basically the story we're supposed to learn there is about the middle path, that true happiness is to be found between asceticism and riches, because he, or whatever gender you want to place on Mara, is tempting all of those things that Shakyamuni thinks that he might need to return to, because he tried being extremely rich and that didn't help. He tried to be an ascetic and almost starve himself to death, and that didn't help. So he just sat down and found a middle path, and then he had doubt on if that was correct or if he should return to any of those paths. So there's a clear message in there what to learn. But the story, I'm not an expert on early Chan Buddhism or Bodhidharma, but I do believe that that's simply a funny tale, basically. And that's why he's always depicted as this very staring, very intense person staring at a wall. And we do not know if the story about his eyelids came before those drawings or after. So there might be explanations to the drawings, or the drawings might be a result of those stories. And of course, it's easy to draw, because the story goes that he sat looking at a wall for 9 years. But according to the tea leaf story, he fell asleep during the 7th year. So he got so mad that he tore off his eyelids and threw them on the ground, and they turned into tea leaves. And tea, of course, gives us energy, not to fall asleep. So that's sort of the symbolism between you can find there, like drink tea if you're tired. I guess that's a lesson.
I'd like to thank my guest, Mr. Leonhard, for speaking with me here today, and I shall do so now. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
Here's the thing. Sometime, and probably several times, you've heard someone say there's an exception to every rule. I'm telling you this is axiomatically false. There's an exception to every rule is a rule, and by its own internal logic, it would mean there's an exception to that rule, which would therefore mean there is a rule with no exceptions. Making the statement that there's an exception to every rule is meaningless. Times are bad, children no longer obey their parents, and everyone is writing a book. So says Marcus Tullius Cicero, one of the most celebrated orators and politicians of ancient Rome. Except, he didn't. Misattributed quotations make for great segments on this show, because I get to correct a misconception and tell you an interesting story. So where did this quote come from? Like many snappy quips, this one got attributed to a lot of different sources, and Cicero is just the most recent one. In 1908, it was attributed to an Assyrian clay tablet from 3800 BCE. By 1948, it came from an Egyptian priest. You know, any of them, from 4000 BCE. So is it suddenly new for the old to criticize the young? No. In 1907, Kenneth John Freeman was writing about Socrates for his dissertation. He summarized Socrates' complaints about Athenian use in 410 BCE as thus: children began to be tyrants, not slaves of their households. They no longer rose from their seats when an elder entered the room. They contradicted their parents, chattered before company, gobbled up dainties at the table, and committed various offenses against Hellenistic tastes, such as crossing their legs. Thanks for watching, and may the road rise with you.
If that makes any sense.